I want to go back. I want to tie what you're saying into something that Tatiana talked about sort of this unprecedented rain that happened in Dubai. And of course, we remember those dramatic pictures of the airport being taken out. It was only a couple of years ago I flew from Jeddah, where it was flooded, to Dubai, where it was flooded, and I'm thinking this should not be happening. But of course, this is the new reality. But in Valencia, they had 8 inches of rain in an hour, in 1 hour, 8 inches of rain, and in one day they had more rain than in the previous 20 months. So these are super. I think you call it a supercell, Tatiana. These clouds, and again, the nature of what's happening is changing. And as you say, Chris, on the idea of funding, it was very interesting that the Indian representative at COP29 said that the offer of $300 billion a year was completely unacceptable and an optical illusion. But of course, India is considered as an emerging nation under the United Nations treaties, as is China is considered as a developing country. So these are countries that think that India should be given money, even though they have a space research, they have a space program. They're putting satellites on Mars and on the moon, and they have the 100 Smart Cities program, and yet they want to take money away from Pacific Islanders because they feel that sort of we are the people who need to receive that. It is a tough world out there. We in the ISRM, and we've been looking at this a lot. We have the Centre for the Study of Wicked Problems, which we're trying to sort of develop as a centre to have these conversations. But one of the things that we say is that, in our opinion, we do not have a problem with global warming. We do not have a problem with climate change. We do not. We have a problem with human greed and stupidity. And if you don't get rid of human greed and stupidity, you can't talk about climate change as something out there to be dealt with if you have human greed and stupidity. And if you get rid of human greed and stupidity, you're in with a chance. Many things to discuss. I'd like to, just as a sort of a starting focal point, I want to talk about this idea of our changing planet. I was speaking to somebody in the EU recently, beginning of this year in Geneva, and I said, what is the EU's plan to run Europe at 40 degrees? 40 degrees sort of is about 100, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And he said, we don't have one. We don't have one. But you can't run Europe at 100. Europe is not designed to be run at 105 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius. It's just not. Our infrastructure is not designed. Our systems are not designed. So let's just, as a beginning of it, we always start with the risk register. What does the world, we're talking about now 2030 crisis, 2030, moving out to 2050. What is the world going to look like? I mean, are we going to see these increased tendencies? Are we going to see cities underwater? I mean, I think somebody mentioned about the coastal issues. Pretty well all of our major cities are either on the coast or on the rivers. And they are all going to be flooded out, not as a rare event, but as a natural part of the world we live in. What does the world look like when our cities are underwater? I'm talking too much, so I'm going to shut up and I'm going to ask you. So please feel free to answer that, or feel free to completely ignore that and talk about something else if you were to talk about something else, which is fine. Eduardo, we'll come back to you. Plenty to discuss. Your thoughts, sir.
Well, it's very interesting, this thing you are saying. In this line, Barcelona, in the new climate plan, will do a simulation for prepare the organization inside and the coordination between emergencies and all the stakeholders in society and the inside framework and organization. We have to be prepared to the day that the city will have a heat wave about 50 degrees Celsius. Okay, we have this plan to develop in the next years. Okay, and we will do this simulation in the city. The thing is very likely that we will have this kind of episode inside our city. Then we can say okay, it's likely, but are you sure you will go to the 50 degrees? I'm not sure, but I think we will have one day or 1 week with this middle temperature. Okay. And I can talk about floods too in Barcelona. Okay. For example, I was talking with my colleague of Cycle of Water in Barcelona. They manage all the sewer and all the drainage in the city. Okay, and they have the emergency plans for floods in the city. Okay, and they have very well identified all the neighborhoods and streets that will be underwater in a very heavy event of rain. Okay, well, we have these emergency plans, but I ask him, but do we know what is happening there in these neighborhoods? Are they aware? They have the information. We know about their vulnerabilities there. They are rich, they are poor, they are elderly, they are young. What happened with these people? And he answered, yes, of course, we don't know. We don't know. We have to study what's happening there, and we have to communicate with them, okay, and support in everything they need in the case of a flood happens, okay. But now in our emergency plans, we don't have all this information developed, okay, and this is another thing that we have to do in the next months for put the focus in the important things that are what's happening with that people and what happens before the floods with the early warnings alarm, during the floods, and after the floods. Okay. Well, more or less, this is two of the more important challenges in our city in Barcelona, and as an example.
Thank you, Edward. And of course, the problem is, I mean, the question is, will it reach 50 degrees? There's absolutely no reason why not. I mean, if we are seeing the rise is actually growing exponentially. When we had the record-breaking temperatures in the UK in 2022, a couple of years ago, the previous record temperature had been 37.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Celsius. It went up to 40.2. It didn't go up by tenths or 2/10. It went up by 2.5 degrees. I mean, that is an incredible jump. It is an almost unthinkable jump. So we're seeing these incremental increases now in pretty well everything we look at. It is exponential to the power of exponential almost. Kirsten, let's bring you in because, of course, you were involved in this very much. I'm sure the points that Edward made resonate with you. So I'm going to add another question, which is, are we learning lessons? I mean, you spoke about sort of building back the same as it was before. Part of being resilient, people think resilience is to absorb, maintain functionality, and then recover. But it has to be to learn. We have to learn. If we're not learning, then we're just repeating the same problems. So with everything else, I'm going to add that to the mix as well. Are we learning lessons?
No, that's the short answer. No, I don't believe we are. We're great at doing the after-action reviews and debriefs, capturing observations, but we're not great at actually, updating the plans, the procedures, going back and seeing whether, what we did made a difference. So the short answer from my perspective is no. There's probably an argument for some very slow, continuous improvement, but on the ground, my experience in 2022 was no. So the data for flood was out of date by about 10, 11 years. I had raised the issue of flood modelling at our regional emergency management planning committee, and it was brushed away. Raised the issue of climate change not being part of the conversation when we were doing our risk assessments at the municipal level. Again, the comment was, well, we just look at, what's happened in the past. We don't look at what might happen in the future. That's not how we plan. I want to bang your head against a brick wall.
Okay, just as a bit of you want to bang their head against a brick wall.
No,
Sorry,
I just feel like,
if I can give you some advice on this one, that's the way to go. Yeah.
I just feel like banging my head against a brick wall. It's interesting because to me, it seemed a lack of systems thinking, consequence thinking, looking at the worst case scenario, all of that in that space. So it'd be very interesting to see. We had a parliamentary inquiry. Let's see what the government's response is to that parliamentary inquiry, because there were a lot of recommendations. And then what the next step is, that would be my litmus test, I guess, to how serious government is going to be, because the community are already, they're already moving. So yeah, let's see what that looks like in terms of heat. So Chris mentioned, how many people actually died from heat in 2009. Victorians don't believe that heat is an emergency. So every time you see a heat health warning or a heat wave, which was last week, we're in spring and we've already had over 30 degrees. The Bureau of Meteorology did issue a heat wave warning. Just the commentary that you see on social media is, it's not it gets hot in Australia. What a big deal. The federal government, the Commonwealth government, is talking about behavioural insights into our warnings. So definitely we need that from a heat perspective. We need to partner with our media outlets who, do silly things like stand in floodwaters while they're reporting about floods, calling floods 1 in 100 year floods. Like, we've moved on. We don't call them 1 in 100 year floods anymore. Educating the community around what the risk is with floods. It's a 1% or a 2%. It's not it's not going to happen once in every 100 years. So there's some things there. I guess the other one that I did want to bring to the attention of everyone on the call is I'm seeing some interesting work come out of New South Wales. So Chris, you're probably familiar with this, around what's called a disaster adaptation plan. So it's a connection between their emergency planning and their strategic planning. So you have an event run over an area, and then you've got to go back and look at your land use planning and your infrastructure planning, and your disaster adaptation plan guides you in some of those decision making. So do we allow people to just do their homes up, along the banks of the river again, or do we identify that we should actually start looking at moving those communities? That planning is embedded in legislation, which hopefully would force government to start thinking about how they're going to fund that, because that is probably one of the biggest issues that we have. We're hearing about our budgets at state and federal level. They're just broken. Like, we just don't have any money. And so, how do we get that prioritised? Putting it in legislation is one of the ways in which we could possibly do that.
Thanks for that, Kirsten. I can see that somebody's just put up the numbers I was going to put up. Who is that? Well done, whoever you are. Chris Miller. I was going to say we had in Europe, we had in 2022 we had about 60,000 heatwave deaths, 60,000 plus heatwave deaths. Andrew Blades is now changing his comments because you've used the word systemic thinking, which is Andrew Blades' particular bugbear. And it is about systemic thinking. It is about systemic thinking. When we put together the ISRM, our mission statement still says, that the purpose of the ISRM is to create a platform and a space where academics, practitioners, and policymakers can come together to have a grown-up conversation. We want to have a grown-up conversation. It seems that we're not having a grown-up conversation about this.